Oklahoma Gardening is a production of the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the land grant mission of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University, dedicated to improving the quality of life of the citizens of Oklahoma through research-based information. Underwriting assistance for our program is provided by the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry, helping to keep Oklahoma green and growing. Today on Oklahoma Gardening, we are going to take a closer look at yuccas. Then we visit with the people at Our Daily Bread Food and Resource Center as we explore their vegetable garden. Finally, we come back here to the Botanic Garden where we turn an ordinary garden object into a creative plant display. Often we talk about yuccas in the landscape, but today I wanted to give them a little bit more attention. Yuccas in general are a really great landscape plant, especially for Oklahoma. They are native and they can handle zones 5 to 11, so they can handle a lot of conditions. Now, the only real requirements they need are well-drained soil and also full sun. There's a couple of varieties that actually do even better in Oklahoma that I wanted to mention. This particular one is known as Adam's needle yucca or Yucca filamentosa. It actually got its species name because of the filaments that come off of those leaves that you see that look kind of like threads hanging from them. Now, it will grow larger and larger, and in fact, when it's flowering, it will produce a spike anywhere from 5 to 8 feet tall, but possibly even larger than that. As the plant grows, it might get some height to it as well, but it will also produce offsets off of the main plant. So you'll start to see clumps of these form as well. Now with Yucca filamentosa, there are a couple of other cultivars on the market if you're looking for a little bit more interest in the vegetation. One is called Bright Edge that has a green leaf with yellow margins. And there's also Color Guard that has a yellow leaf with green margins. Now, the neat thing about yuccas that is happening right now is that they're in bloom, and this is actually a really critical stage for a symbiotic relationship that you might not be aware of. So the only pollinator for yuccas is the yucca moth, which is a small white moth. So as it has hatched out of its cocoon that's in the ground, it actually flies up here looking for a mate, and so this is sort of a breeding ground for those yucca moths. Again, it's a small white moth, so you don't necessarily always see it in the flowers. It blends in really well. But what happens is the female will then lay her eggs in the flower. As that larva then hatches, from those eggs, the larva will feed on some of those seeds. But that symbiotic relationship happens because the yucca moth, in that process of mating and laying those eggs, will also pollinate those yucca flowers. Now, even though the larva will eat some of the seeds, it knows not to eat too many of them, and so therefore the larva is able to get some food from this yucca as well to reproduce again for the next season. So it's an interesting symbiotic relationship that's happening. Now, there's another yucca that's native to our Oklahoma, and that's Yucca glauco, which we often see in western Oklahoma. It has a similar look to this Adam's needle or Yucca filamentosa. However, instead of the broader leaf, it's going to have a more narrow leaf and is even a little bit sharper on its tips. So you want to be careful with it also. It's a little less forgiving when you back into it. Now, regardless of which yucca you use, you want to make sure that when you plant them in the landscape, you're not planting them next to a sidewalk or next to a play area because, again, those tips can be a little bit pokey if you back into them. Now, there's another landscape plant that we often reference as yucca, and that is a red yucca. It actually is not in the Asparagiaceae family as the true yuccas are. It is in the Agaveaceae family. It's going to have a similar growth habit, however, it's going to stay at its lower clumping height of 2 to 3 feet. Now, when it does bloom, it's going to have a spike of about 5 to 6 feet tall. It's really going to grab people's attention because of that red color. Now when we say red yucca, that's a little bit of a range. It's sort of a rosy soft pink to a red color. If you're looking for a true red, you want to go with a cultivar called Brake Lights, as it's going to give you that bright red color to it. Again, there is another cultivar though, if you're looking to add a little more variety into your garden. While it's a fallacy that red yucca is even a true yucca, it's also not necessarily a red yucca. In fact, there is a cultivar that is a yellow red yucca, if you will. It is still a Hesperella parviflora. So it's the same genus and species, but a different color. Regardless of which yucca, true yucca or false yucca, you choose to add into your landscape, they're a great addition to any drought-tolerant, low-maintenance garden, especially in full sun, away from those sidewalks.
Good morning. We'd like to welcome you back to the garden at Our Daily Bread here in Stillwater. And it's been a season since we've done a segment from the garden, so we wanted to just have you back and update you on the progress. And so here we are this morning. I'm standing next to our trusty wood chip pile, and we have our raised beds in the background, and I'm so thankful that we do, because we've had in excess of 4 inches of rain this week, and I feel bad saying that, because I know that that's a drop in the bucket compared to what many of you have had to deal with. So for those of you out there that are just completely swamped, hang in there, and hopefully the weather will line up for us. This is now the third year of production for this garden, and that means with our third year of growing season and then a couple of years of brainstorming, we're now about 5 years into this project. So I just want to give you a very quick synopsis of our processes so far, so you'll kind of know what a community garden model like this is all about. So we spent, like I say, a couple of hours talking about it. First it was dreaming, then it was brainstorming, then it was some reality checks, and then we started dipping our toes into the concept. We actually began with the composting operation. Was it going to be a viable model for us, given everything else Our Daily Bread has going on here? Basically, would it work or would it not? So the bottom line is the garden a viable option for the organization here at Our Daily Bread? And so I can report to you now that yes, it is indeed viable. The garden is flourishing. We've been overwhelmed with positive feedback from the community, and we're really, really excited about that. You know, as an OSU Extension educator, my role is to provide science-based information. And so I can come to you and I can give you information about growing plants, and you need to do this or you need to do that, or this bug is good, this bug is bad. Yes, you're going to have that disease because the weather is swampy, things like that. When it comes to a community garden, things get a lot more complex than that, because you introduce the human component into the garden. And so you're relying on well-wishers and volunteers and funders and employees, all of these different people that have important roles to play in the garden. And that makes things very complicated. And then you add to that the reminder that a garden, just like humans, is a living organism. And what is true for the garden today might not be true for the garden tomorrow. So I say all that to say, I wish we could come to you and say, here is a blueprint. This is everything you need to know about operating a successful community garden, but that would be disingenuous of us if we did that. So just want you to know that if you have an idea or a hope or a dream for a garden, it's a big job, and be prepared for hills and valleys along the way. But it is absolutely worth the effort. So now as the garden undergoes another transformation, and that is from me being kind of the hands-on garden manager to a full-time garden manager, that is going to allow me to transition my role again from actually working in the garden on a regular basis to more of an occasional advice giver. And of course, my favorite role of special assistant in charge of Bermuda grass eradication. So thank you for coming out today.
Hello everybody, I'm Loren Park. I am the garden manager at Our Daily Bread. We have some very exciting things happening at the community garden right now. We have some gorgeous strawberries that are actually done for the season because it got so hot. We have a beautiful grape trellis that you just walked through, and we have so many more things. Back here we have our tomatoes that are just doing absolutely amazing. We have a little bit of leaf curl from the fluctuation in temperature and water. Throughout the past few weeks or so. It got very hot and then pretty cool with a lot of moisture. So we're having some difficulties with that, but they're producing great nonetheless. In the very back of this garden, we have some Brussels sprouts that we are kind of experimenting with. This is our first time growing such a large crop of Brussels sprouts, so we are learning as we go. Most Brussels sprouts will be a lot bigger than this, but since we are organic, we cannot put as much fertilizer into it. They're not quite done yet, but we are so excited to see them. Another thing that we have going on at the garden is we have some new signage to help our guests know when to harvest the vegetables and when to not. The community does not know as much as we might know as normal gardeners. So whenever they come into the garden, they might see a head of broccoli that they get from the store, and they will harvest that whenever it's supposed to be 10 times the size of that and feed their whole family. So we have these new signs that say harvest away and not ready to harvest yet, and this helps the community indicate whether they can take that food home to their families or not. The community garden definitely is not big enough to feed everybody in Payne County. It acts as a classroom to bring the garden back to your homes. The Food and Resource Center on site is here to help people in Payne County that are food insecure. The community garden is a community garden. Anyone in Payne County can come out and harvest as much as you need from the garden. Every first and third Friday of the month, we have what is called Freebie Friday. If you have already came and gotten your produce for the month, you can come out and get more produce along with some plants if they are available. So come see us.
I know sometimes during this gardening season it might rain too much or it might be too hot to get out, but that doesn't mean that you can't still get out and do something for the garden. So we've got today a project that you can either do in a nice shady area, in your garden shed, or even in your garage or home. So the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to make a clay sphere. You can either do a full sphere or a half sphere, but you're going to need some clay pots in order to do that. Now we went with just a kind of a hobby craft pot because they're a little bit thinner, which means they're lighter weight, which is important when you're trying to put this actually into the garden. So this is a 4.5 inch, whereas this is a 2.5 inch. I will say the 2.5 inch is a little bit easier, but keep in mind anytime you're planting a smaller pot, that means there's going to be less root zone, and also it's going to dry out faster. So the 2.5 really works well for more of a succulent planting, whereas the 4.5 will allow you to do some different plants. And keep in mind, think about where you're going to put this. So again, obviously, if you're doing something with succulents, it's going to need to be in full sun as well. So the first thing that you're going to need is you're going to need 41 pots. And so that's a fair amount of pots. If you go with the smaller, obviously it's cheaper. These come in a nice 6-pack, so you can get several of them that way. And what we're going to do is we're going to lay out these pots in a fashion in a circle. It sort of helps to do a little bit of a dry run first, but you're going to need 11 pots in that first circle. So it obviously helps to work on a very flat surface because these pots tend to want to roll a little bit, and you might need a few extra hands just to kind of help stabilize it as well. And then we worked with the next row, and you kind of place that second row nestled in between that first row. So it kind of filled in those valleys between those pots. And we found that 8 pots worked the best on that. And then you have a hole at the top, which you've got to fill to complete your sphere. So we found that 3 pots sort of worked well. Now keep in mind, you are going to still have gaps, especially depending on what pots you're working with. The holes will vary between those clay pots, but that's okay. That's why we have plants to kind of fill in and cover some of the ugliness and also the glue. So once you've done a dry run and you're pleased with how it looks, again, it's going to be very unstable until you glue it. Go ahead and make sure you've counted how many you have on each of those rings so that you can replicate it, deconstruct it, and then this time you're going to glue it. So we have found that some sort of outdoor strong bonding adhesive caulk works really well. You're going to need more glue than you think, so don't buy just a small tube. Go ahead and get a whole caulk gun, especially if you're doing the larger pots. And so you're going to want to glue as you go, as you build each ring. So building the first ring of 11, glue those together. You can go ahead and glue the next row. You don't have to wait for it to dry. And then finally put in your top 3. Now keep in mind, again, as you're gluing this, they're going to shift a little bit. So where they might have been connected with glue, they might not as you finish that. So you want to go back through with glue and kind of fill in some more of those cracks where they're connecting and touching to make sure that they're well bonded. And then of course, once you've got it glued, you're going to let it set for a good period of time. Depending on which type of glue, there's a recommended level or recommended time to allow it to sit. But let it set and make sure that it's well dried before you do anything further with it at that point. Now you might find that once you've gotten half of your sphere completed that it was a bit of a struggle with that process. So you might think, let's call it, that's good, and that's okay. So you can use just a half sphere. In fact, this larger clay pot, that's what we're intending. We're just going to place this out in the garden. Now, if you want to do a full sphere, what you're going to do is do the similar pattern, although you're going to leave out these top 3 pots. And let me show you why. So here we've got a full sphere, and you can see it is planted already, but I'm going to go ahead and lift this up. We didn't actually glue it to the bottom sphere so that you can see we've got our 2 rings, but we didn't actually plant or glue 3 more rings to the inside of that. And that allows that sphere to really set really well on a flat surface. So you can see I had 2 half spheres. I didn't put the 3 in the center there, and that allows us to use it as a nice place to set that way. So this is a good thing. You can make it a sphere and not glue it to the top part, and then you can still use this as a centerpiece on a table, or you can put it out in your garden as a decorative piece as well. So we're going to go ahead and put this back, and I'm going to show you now how to go about planting your clay pot. So we've got this larger one here that we're going to go ahead and plant. You can see it's nice and dry. Now you can see some of our clay pots are a little bit unlevel. We've got holes. We're going to fill those. You can see on the smaller one what we used was some sphagnum moss just to fill, just to sort of give it some time as those sedums grow in. Now, one thing to keep in mind, especially if you're doing the sphere, maybe use some trailing things down, because you're not going to be able to plant these lower clay pots because they're actually upside down. So it's really hard to keep anything in there. But by planting trailing plants, that will kind of cover that base a little bit more. So on this particular one, we're planning on putting it in our shade garden. So we've got some shade tolerant plants versus the succulent one that you have here next to us. And so we're going to need some potting soil to fill in some of those holes. So we're going to go ahead and put a little bit in each one of these to get us started. So we have a variety of different plants that we're using, and I will say these like smaller quart size will probably fit the best in here. However, we worked with what we had, and so we also found some sedges to add a little bit to cover some of those areas that might not be so pretty. So we've got different colors of foliage with our sedges, and then we've also got a nice autumn fern here. That I think we'll be able to shave down the roots on that. We've got a few more begonias we're going to add in here, and then also some holly ferns as well. So a lot of foliage, because this is again going to be a shade feature that we put in our shade garden. So we're going to start off sort of like flower arranging right now. We have several of these holly ferns, so we're going to start off with that. Again, these are sort of these like quart size. So we're going to go ahead and shave off a little bit of this soil. And then we're just going to sort of nestle these in somewhere around periodically throughout. If you do happen to come across any damaged leaves, go ahead and clean those out like you would any other garden or any other plant. You can see what it looks like once you finally got it finished. It's definitely worth the patience and kind of the craftiness of being able to construct it and giving it time to dry and then finally planting it. Now again, this is filled with plants. You wouldn't even necessarily have to plant each container because it's kind of nice to see some of those clay pots exposed. However, we did plant every one of them here. And so you can see how all of this foliage really covers some of those oopses that you might have had during your construction process. When you're designing this, it's sort of like a flower arrangement. So you're going to start with your greenery. We started with this holly fern and just sort of placed it periodically throughout this semicircle here. And then we went in with some of the sedges. So we have this sort of golden sedge and then also the variegated sedge. Again, kind of putting those sporadically throughout and making sure that you're not putting any two right next to each other. So you got that color throughout. Finally, we went in with this little punch of bright pink in there from this shade begonia. Again, adding those pops of color. But it's definitely worth the process. And what's nice about this is you'll be able to use it from season to season, whether it's annuals or perennials. So now we just need to find that perfect place to put it in the garden. There are a lot of great horticulture activities this time of year. Be sure and consider some of these events in the weeks ahead. Next week on Oklahoma Gardening, we take a closer look at a prickly plant. We have a garden update that is very exciting. Garden writer Dee Nash shares another part of her garden. And finally, I've got a tool that will really hold up. To find out more information about show topics as well as recipes, videos, articles, fact sheets, and other resources, including a directory of local extension offices, be sure to visit our website at oklahomagardening.okstate.edu. And we always have great information, answers to questions, photos, and gardening discussion on your favorite social media as well. Join in on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can find this entire show and other recent shows as well as individual segments on our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. Tune in to our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel to watch segments from previous hosts. Oklahoma Gardening is produced by the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University. The Botanic Garden at OSU is home to our studio gardens, and we encourage you to come visit this beautiful Stillwater gem. We would like to thank our generous underwriter, the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry. Additional support is also provided by Pond Pro Shops, Greenleaf Nursery and the Garden Debut Plants, the Oklahoma Horticultural Society, and Tulsa Garden Club.